My husband grabbed my neck and tightened a necklace around it, then said, "If you ever take that necklace off, that might be the last time you breathe." "Honey, you're scaring me," I said. Not once in our marriage did he ever act so aggressive. He'd always been so sweet and patient. But now I barely recognized him. "Promise me," he yelled, shaking my shoulders. I nodded slowly. "I promise," I whispered. But I never should have made that promise because after that, things just kept getting weirder with him. My husband started texting me constantly, asking me where I was, where I'd been, where I was going. And when I did go out, he was somehow there. Sometimes in the corner of the bar, sometimes outside waiting inside his car, watching me through the window. My gut told me it was something to do with the necklace. Every time it made a beeping sound, I swear he was there, tracking me. But then I thought, no way my own husband would do that, right? Turns out it was the necklace, but I wasn't getting tracked. It was something so much worse. I started getting sick next. Headaches that wouldn't go away. Dizzy spells when I stood up too fast. I was tired all the time, even though I was sleeping fine. When I mentioned it to him, his eyes scanned my body like he was searching for something. "What kind of symptoms exactly? Any numbness? What about your vision? Any problems seeing?" he'd ask. But his questions felt eerily specific, like he was checking boxes on a list. Over the week, my symptoms got worse. I had trouble focusing at work. My vision would blur randomly. I felt confused sometimes, like I couldn't remember what I was doing. And each time I felt like throwing up or blacking out, my necklace would vibrate against my sternum, almost like it was making me sick, maybe poisoning me somehow. I tried taking the necklace off one night before bed, thinking, what if the symptoms go away without it? But I didn't even get a chance to check. My husband saw the necklace on my nightstand and freaked out, raising his voice. "You promised me. You can't take it off." He grabbed the necklace and placed it back on me while I laid in bed too weak to fight back. Then it happened. The next morning, I collapsed in the kitchen. As soon as I hit the floor, my vision went dark, and suddenly, my left arm started tingling. Before I knew it, I'd lost all feeling of it. The necklace suddenly got burning hot and started beeping so loud I thought it would wake the neighbors. My husband ran in seconds later. But instead of dropping to his knees and checking on me, he started whispering to himself. "Thank God it worked," he said over and over, kneeling down and smiling as he placed his hand on my necklace. It worked? The poison in the necklace worked? I thought, still trembling. Somehow, that's when paramedics entered our door and whisked me away. What's strange is I'd never called them. And on top of that, when my husband spoke to them, he explained all my symptoms with perfect accuracy, even the ones I never told him about. I was scared, but then I thought, if he really wanted to harm me, why would there be paramedics around? Even in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, my husband held my hand gently, whispering that everything would be okay soon. "Ma'am, did you know that you had a severe blood clotting disorder?" the doctor asked after running a few tests. "You almost had a stroke. If it weren't for the medical alert device around your neck and your husband's quick actions, you might be here with half your body permanently paralyzed." I was stunned. All this time, these past few weeks, I kept thinking that my husband was out here trying to harm me when he was constantly looking out for me. I reached out to my husband, who gave back an apologetic look. "I didn't mean to be controlling, but I couldn't risk something happening to you while you were out without me. I couldn't imagine losing you. I had to keep you safe," he said, squeezing my hand tightly. He pulled out his phone, showing me an app that monitored my vitals as proof. The doctor came back again with my complete blood work, but this time, his expression was darker. He asked my husband to step out for a moment before interrogating me. "Ma'am, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Are you taking a medication called clomiphene? You have significant amounts in your system. The levels suggest you've been having months of regular doses." His face scrunched up as he frowned. "Clomiphene causes blood clotting disorders as a side effect, especially at elevated doses. If you're not personally taking it, I'm afraid someone has been giving this to you regularly, possibly without your consent." That's when I realized it. Before I could tell the doctor, my husband re-entered the room with a smile. "I think she needs to rest now, Doc. I'll take over from here." The doctor's words about clomiphene kept playing in my head while my husband stood there smiling like nothing was wrong. I needed to act normal or he'd know something was up. I forced my face into what I hoped looked like a tired smile and told him I was really exhausted. My voice came out weaker than I wanted, but maybe that helped sell it. He nodded and squeezed my hand again. That same gentle touch that used to make me feel safe. Now it made my skin crawl. The doctor looked between us for a second, his jaw tight, but then he left the room without saying anything else. My husband pulled the chair closer to my bed and started talking about how glad he was that I was okay, how scared he'd been when I collapsed. I just nodded and kept my eyes half closed, pretending I was too tired to talk much. Every muscle in my body felt tense, but I tried to stay loose, tried to breathe normal. The nurse came back about 20 minutes later to check my vitals. She wrapped the blood pressure cuff around my arm, and I caught her eye, trying to make her understand something was wrong without actually saying it. She held my gaze for just a second longer than normal, and I saw something shift in her expression. She finished taking my blood pressure and temperature, writing everything down on her clipboard. Then she mentioned that visiting hours would be ending in about 30 minutes, looking straight at my husband when she said it. He frowned and checked his watch but said he'd stay as long as they'd let him. The nurse nodded and told him the night shift was pretty strict about the rules. I felt this tiny bit of hope that maybe she understood what I was trying to tell her. My husband finally left when the nurse came back and told him visiting hours were over. He kissed my forehead and said he'd be back first thing in the morning, that he'd bring me some things from home. I smiled and said okay, watching him walk out the door. As soon as he was gone, I felt like I could breathe again. The nurse came back in a few minutes later, and I asked her if I could talk to someone privately about my situation. I didn't even finish the sentence before she nodded and said she'd get the social worker on call. Her face told me she knew exactly what I meant without me having to spell it out. She touched my shoulder gently and said someone would be here soon, that I was safe now. Tabitha Caldwell showed up less than 20 minutes later. She was maybe 40 with kind eyes and this calm way of moving that made me feel a little less panicked. She introduced herself as the hospital's domestic violence liaison and pulled a chair up next to my bed. She explained that everything I told her would stay between us, that she was just here to help me figure out what I wanted to do next. No pressure, no judgment. She had a notebook, but she didn't open it yet, just sat there waiting for me to be ready. I started crying before I even said anything, and she handed me tissues and waited. I told her everything. The promise he forced me to make about the necklace. How he texted me constantly asking where I was. How he showed up everywhere I went, watching me from his car or from across the room. The symptoms that started getting worse over time. His weird specific questions about what I was feeling. How he wouldn't let me take the necklace off even when I was too weak to fight him. Tabitha listened without interrupting, just nodding and writing things down. When I got to the part about him whispering that it worked when I collapsed on the kitchen floor, she stopped writing and looked up at me. Her face was serious but not shocked, like she'd heard stories like this before. She asked me a few questions about timing and wrote down my answers. Every time I said something that seemed important, she'd nod in this way that told me she was seeing the same red flags I was finally seeing. Tabitha put her pen down and explained that the clomiphene in my system had to come from somewhere. Someone had been giving it to me regularly without my knowledge. She said that was assault at minimum, maybe even attempted murder depending on what the police found out about his intentions. Her voice was steady and clear when she said this, not trying to scare me but making sure I understood how serious it was. She asked if I'd noticed him preparing my food or drinks in ways that seemed unusual, or if he'd been secretive about anything I was eating. I sat there thinking about the past few months, trying to remember what had changed. That's when it hit me. The vitamin smoothies. He'd started making them for me every single morning about 4 months ago. He said they'd help with my energy since I was always tired. He always made them while I was in the bathroom getting ready for work. By the time I came out, he'd have this big glass ready for me, already blended and poured. He'd stand there and watch me drink it, smiling and asking if it tasted okay. I'd always finish the whole thing because he seemed so happy about taking care of me. Now I felt sick thinking about what was actually in those smoothies. I told Tabitha about them and watched her write it all down, her pen moving fast across the page. Tabitha said we needed to document everything I could remember about when the symptoms started and what changed in my routine around that time. She pulled out this worksheet that had a timeline on it with spaces to fill in dates and events. We started going through the past few months together, marking down when he gave me the necklace, when the smoothies started, when I first got the headaches. She asked about my work schedule and whether he knew when I'd be home. She asked about our finances and whether he controlled the money. Every question helped me see the pattern more clearly. By the time we finished the timeline, I could see exactly how he'd planned everything. The smoothies started right before the symptoms. The necklace came a few weeks later. The tracking and constant texting ramped up around the same time. The nurse knocked and came back in, looking uncomfortable. She said my husband had called the nurse's station asking about my condition and wanting to know when he could come back tomorrow. Tabitha's whole body tensed, and she immediately asked the nurse to get hospital security to flag my room. She explained that no information about me should be released to anyone without my direct permission. She said she wanted privacy restrictions on my chart and my room number removed from the public directory. The nurse nodded and left to make it happen. Tabitha turned back to me and said we needed to move fast now because he was already trying to maintain control. Tabitha explained that I could stay in the hospital for another day or two while we got things arranged. She said the medical team would document everything in my chart, including the suspected poisoning. This documentation would be really important if I decided to go to the police, which she said she strongly recommended given how serious this was. She told me that what he did wasn't just abuse, it was a crime. He'd poisoned me for months and almost killed me. She asked if I was willing to talk to a detective who specialized in domestic violence cases involving medical harm. I nodded yes, even though I was scared. Part of me still couldn't believe this was real, that my husband had actually tried to hurt me, but the evidence was right there in my blood work and in the timeline we'd just made. I told Tabitha to call whoever she needed to call. I was done protecting him. Tabitha pulled out her phone right away and scrolled through her contacts. She found the number and pressed call, putting it on speaker so I could hear. The phone rang 3 times before someone picked up. Tabitha explained who she was, and that she had a patient who needed to speak with someone about suspected poisoning by a spouse. The voice on the other end asked a few questions about my situation, and Tabitha answered them quickly, using words like domestic violence and medical harm and non-consensual medication. The detective said she could come by tomorrow morning before visiting hours started. Tabitha thanked her and hung up, then turned to me and said, "Detective Petrov was one of the best at handling these kinds of cases." I nodded but couldn't really process what was happening. My life had become a police investigation in the span of an hour. Tabitha squeezed my hand and told me she'd be back first thing in the morning. After she left, the nurse came in to check my vitals one more time and asked if I needed anything to help me sleep. I said no, because I needed to think. The room felt too quiet once everyone was gone. I stared at the ceiling tiles and started going through everything in my head. The smoothies were the obvious thing. He'd made them every single morning for months. Big glass, already blended, always waiting when I came out of the bathroom. Strawberry banana with protein powder, or so he said. He'd watch me drink the whole thing and smile like he was so proud of taking care of me. But what else? The tea. He'd bring me chamomile tea almost every night before bed. Said it would help me relax and sleep better. He'd steep it himself in the kitchen and bring it up in my favorite mug. I always drank it because it was sweet that he remembered I liked 2 sugars. Now I wondered what else was in that tea besides chamomile and sugar. The vitamins, too. He'd started setting out vitamins with my breakfast around the same time as the smoothies. Little white pills in a small dish next to my plate. He said they were for my immune system and energy levels. I'd take them without thinking because why wouldn't I trust my husband? I felt so stupid lying there in that hospital bed. The pattern was so obvious now. Everything he prepared for me. Everything he handed me directly. That's when I was getting dosed. I never saw him open the vitamin bottles. Never watched him make the smoothies. Never saw what he put in the tea. He'd controlled every step of the process, and I'd just gone along with it because I loved him and thought he loved me back. The necklace suddenly felt heavy on my chest even though I knew it wasn't actually hurting me. It had been saving me this whole time, monitoring my vitals and calling for help when I collapsed. But he'd used my fear of it to control me even more. Made me promise never to take it off. Watched me constantly through that app on his phone. I must have finally fallen asleep at some point because the next thing I knew, someone was knocking softly on my door. The sky outside my window was just starting to get light. A woman walked in carrying a leather bag and a coffee cup. She looked like she was in her 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and tired eyes that still managed to look kind. She introduced herself as Detective Petrov and apologized for coming so early. She said she wanted to talk before my husband might show up for visiting hours. I sat up in bed and she pulled a chair close. She explained that she needed to hear everything in my own words and asked if it was okay to record our conversation for the investigation file. I said yes and watched her pull out a small recording device from her bag. She pressed a button and stated the date and time and both our names. Then she looked at me and said to start wherever I felt comfortable starting. I told her about the timeline Tabitha and I had made, about how the smoothies started 4 months ago, how he began working from home more often right around that same time, how he'd get this weird, anxious look on his face if I said I wasn't hungry for breakfast or didn't want the smoothie. I remembered one morning I'd been running late for work and tried to skip it. He actually followed me to the car with the glass and insisted I at least drink half before I left. He'd stood there in the driveway in his pajamas watching me drink it through the car window. Detective Petrov wrote all this down in a notebook, her pen moving fast across the page. She asked specific questions about his work and whether he had medical training. I told her he works in pharmaceutical sales. Her expression changed when I said that. Got darker somehow. She wrote it down carefully and then explained that pharmaceutical sales reps have access to medication samples that regular people can't get. They get drugs that aren't available over the counter, including fertility medications like clomiphene. She asked if he'd ever brought home samples or if I'd seen medication in the house that wasn't prescribed to either of us. I thought about it and realized I had no idea what was in his home office. He kept it locked and said it was because he had confidential client information in there. I'd never questioned it. The doctor knocked and came in with a tablet in his hand. He said my clotting factors were improving now that I was in the hospital and not being exposed to whatever had been causing the problem. Detective Petrov asked him if the hospital could run more toxicology screens to figure out exactly what was in my system and at what levels. The doctor nodded and said he'd order a comprehensive tox screen along with tests for other fertility drugs and hormones. He explained it would take a few days to get all the results back, but that it would give us a complete picture of what I'd been exposed to and for how long. Detective Petrov thanked him and he left to put in the orders. Tabitha came back a little while later with a folder full of paperwork. She sat down on the edge of my bed and explained each form. One would allow the hospital to preserve my blood samples and share results with law enforcement. Another was information about emergency protective orders. She said I could file for one today if I wanted to prevent my husband from contacting me or coming to the hospital. I looked at all the papers spread out on my lap. My hand started shaking as I picked up the pen. This felt so final, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart instead of my own. I signed my name on each line where Tabitha pointed. My signature looked messy and wrong. Tabitha squeezed my shoulder gently and reminded me that I was taking back control by making these choices. I didn't feel like I was in control of anything, but I nodded anyway. My phone started buzzing on the bedside table. I looked at the screen and saw his name. Then it buzzed again, and again. Detective Petrov asked if she could listen to the voicemails. I unlocked my phone and handed it to her. She put it on speaker and pressed play. His first message was soft and concerned, asking if I was okay and saying he was worried about me. The second one was a little more tense, saying he'd tried calling the hospital but they wouldn't tell him anything. The third message was different. His voice had this edge to it that I recognized from when he'd made me promise to wear the necklace. He said I needed to answer him right now and that he had a right to know what was happening with his wife. Detective Petrov looked at me and asked if I'd received all these in the same morning. I checked the timestamps. 37 calls in 2 hours. She took a photo of my call log with her own phone. She asked me if this was normal, if he always called this much. I looked at the screen showing all those missed calls stacked on top of each other and realized, yeah, this was exactly how he'd been acting for months now. I just told myself it was because he was worried about my health, that he loved me so much he couldn't help checking in. But seeing it laid out like that, 37 calls in 2 hours, it looked insane. It looked like something a crazy person would do. The detective wrote something down in her notebook and then explained what happens next. She said she was going to request a search warrant for our house, specifically looking for clomiphene or any other medications and evidence of how he'd been giving them to me. She warned me this would alert him that I'd involved the police, which meant we needed to make sure I had somewhere safe to go before they executed the warrant. Her voice was calm but serious when she said that once he realized I wasn't coming home and that I knew what he'd done, he'd probably escalate. Tabitha spoke up then and said she'd already taken care of it. She explained that she'd arranged for me to stay at a private domestic violence shelter once the hospital discharged me. The location was kept secret from everyone, even family members, and I'd have access to legal help, counseling, and support finding a permanent place to live. She handed me a folder with information about the shelter and said I could stay there as long as I needed to get back on my feet. I felt like everything was moving so fast, like I couldn't keep up with all these decisions being made. Tabitha must have seen the panic on my face because she sat down on the edge of my bed and reminded me that my husband had been poisoning me for months. She said he'd nearly killed me and that acting quickly wasn't optional. It was necessary. She explained that abusers escalate when they lose control, and right now he was about to realize he'd lost all control over me. Detective Petrov got a call a few hours later and stepped into the hallway to take it. When she came back, she said the judge approved the search warrant, and it was scheduled for tomorrow morning while my husband was at work. She explained that officers would make a list of everything they took, and I'd get copies of all the reports, but that I absolutely should not be there during the search for my own safety. She said my husband might have cameras or might come home early, and the last thing anyone wanted was a confrontation while evidence was collected. That evening, I was lying in bed trying to process everything when I heard raised voices at the nurse's station down the hall. My whole body went stiff because I recognized one of the voices. It was him. He was arguing with the nurse, saying he had a right to see his wife and demanding to know why the hospital was keeping information from him. The nurse kept her voice professional but firm, explaining that I'd requested privacy and that she couldn't give him any details about my condition or location. His voice got louder and I could hear him saying this was ridiculous, that he was my husband and he deserved to know what was happening. Then I heard heavier footsteps and a man's voice, probably security, asking him to leave the premises. My heart was beating so hard I thought I might actually have another stroke right there. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, even though my door was closed, and listened to the sounds of him being escorted out. Tabitha had stayed late, and she came into my room as soon as it was quiet again. She sat in the chair next to my bed and explained that what just happened was typical behavior for abusive partners who are losing control. She said his reaction to being denied access proved we'd made the right choice to involve the police and get me somewhere safe. She reminded me that this was exactly the kind of escalation she'd warned me about, and it was only going to get worse once he realized I wasn't coming back. I tried to sleep that night, but I couldn't. Every sound in the hallway made me jump. Every time I heard footsteps, I thought it was him coming back. I kept checking my phone even though I'd blocked his number, half expecting to see messages somehow getting through. The nurse came in twice to check on me, and finally around midnight she brought me something to help me rest. She said my body needed sleep to heal from the clotting disorder, and that I was safe here, that security was watching my floor. The next morning my phone rang and I saw Detective Petrov's name on the screen. My hands shook as I answered. She told me the search warrant had been executed and they'd found exactly what they were looking for. In our garage, hidden behind some boxes, they'd discovered bulk clomiphene citrate powder, along with a digital scale and a bag of empty capsules. She paused and then said they'd also found a notebook with dates and dosages written in his handwriting. It was like a logbook, she explained, documenting every single dose he'd given me over the past 4 months. I felt sick hearing her describe it. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The idea that he'd been measuring out exact amounts, filling capsules, tracking everything like some kind of science experiment made my stomach turn. Detective Petrov's voice got gentler as she continued. She said the evidence was overwhelming, that between the notebook, the materials, and my blood work, the case against him was solid. She told me the prosecutor would likely file charges today, probably for assault with harmful substances and domestic violence. She said given the severity and the evidence, he'd probably be arrested within the next day or two. That afternoon, a nurse came in with discharge papers and a plastic bag full of pill bottles. She went through each one slowly, explaining what the blood thinners were for and how I needed to take them at the same time every day. She handed me a card with my follow-up appointment already scheduled for next week and told me to come back immediately if I had any bleeding or felt dizzy. I signed the papers with shaky hands while she watched, and then she left me alone to get dressed in the clothes Tabitha had brought from my house the day before. I pulled on my jeans and realized they were looser than they should be, and I wondered how much weight I'd lost without noticing. Tabitha knocked and came in just as I was tying my shoes, and she had another man with her who she introduced as Roman, her colleague from the shelter program. He smiled at me kindly and said he'd be driving us in his personal car, so there wouldn't be any official markings that might draw attention. We walked through the hospital hallways and I kept my head down, scared I might see my husband somehow, even though Detective Petrov had told me he was still at home. Roman's car was parked in the back lot and he opened the rear door for me while Tabitha got in front. I climbed into the back seat with my plastic hospital bag of belongings and medications, and I felt like a refugee fleeing from my own life. The drive took about 20 minutes through neighborhoods I didn't recognize. Roman drove carefully and kept checking his mirrors, and I realized he was making sure we weren't being followed. Tabitha turned around in her seat and asked how I was feeling, and I told her I was scared, but also relieved to be leaving the hospital. She nodded and said that was completely normal, that most women feel a mix of emotions when they first leave their abuser. The word abuser hit me hard because I still wasn't used to thinking of my husband that way, even after everything. We pulled up to a regular-looking house on a quiet street with a small front yard and flowers planted along the walkway. Roman parked in the driveway and we all got out, and Tabitha led me to the front door while Roman carried my bag. A woman answered before we even knocked, and she introduced herself as the shelter director and welcomed me inside. The house was warm and clean with comfortable furniture and artwork on the walls, nothing like the cold building I'd imagined. She walked me through the common areas, explaining the kitchen schedule and laundry rules and how the security system worked. Then she took me upstairs to a small bedroom at the end of the hall and handed me a key, explaining that I was the only person with access to this room, and I could lock it from the inside anytime I wanted. I stepped inside and saw a twin bed with a colorful quilt, a small desk under the window, and a dresser against the wall. The director said she'd give me time to settle in and left, closing the door behind her. I sat down on the bed and looked at the lock on the door, and suddenly I started crying because it was the first time in months that I felt truly safe. I unpacked my few things from the hospital bag and lined up my pill bottles on the desk where I could see them. My phone buzzed and I saw Detective Petrov's name on the screen. I answered, and she told me my husband had been arrested an hour ago at his office. She said he was charged with assault with caustic chemicals, giving harmful substances, and domestic violence. Her voice was calm and professional as she explained that bail would be set tomorrow at his first court appearance, and that she was asking the judge to make a no-contact order part of any bail conditions. I asked what would happen if he made bail, and she said the no-contact order would legally prevent him from coming near me or trying to reach me, and that violating it would send him straight back to jail. I thanked her and hung up, then sat there staring at my phone and trying to process that my husband was actually in jail right now. The next morning, Tabitha came by and said there was someone I needed to meet. She took me to a small office on the first floor where a woman in her 50s was waiting with a briefcase full of folders. She introduced herself as Rosemary Mooney and explained she was a divorce attorney who volunteered with the shelter's legal program. She sat down across from me and said I should file for divorce immediately while the criminal case was active. She explained that the criminal charges would support my case for fault-based divorce and help protect my money and property. I asked how long it would take, and she said probably a few months, but that we could get started right away with the paperwork. She pulled out forms and started asking me questions about our marriage, our house, our bank accounts, and I answered everything as best I could, even though my head was spinning. Rosemary wrote everything down in neat handwriting and told me she'd have the papers ready to file by the end of the week. That week went by in a blur of meetings and phone calls and paperwork. Rosemary filed the divorce papers along with a request for me to have exclusive use of our house once the police released it from evidence. She explained that legally I had as much right to the house as he did, and that the court would probably grant me temporary possession given what had happened. I signed more papers than I could count, and tried to remember everything she told me about court dates and legal procedures. My phone rang constantly with calls from Detective Petrov updating me on the case, and from the hospital calling about my follow-up appointments, and from Tabitha checking to make sure I was okay. I felt like I was drowning in information and decisions, but everyone kept telling me I was doing great, and that this was all necessary to protect myself. Then the full toxicology results came back from the hospital. Detective Petrov called and asked if she could come by the shelter to talk to me in person. I met her in the office and she sat down with a serious expression on her face. She said the test showed not just clomiphene but also high levels of estrogen in my system. She explained that my husband had basically been forcing me into fertility treatment without my knowledge or permission. The doctor had told her this was probably his way of trying to get me pregnant as another form of control over me. I felt sick hearing this because it made everything so much worse somehow. Detective Petrov watched me carefully and asked if I was okay, and I nodded even though I wasn't. This news hit me harder than anything else had. We'd talked about having kids early in our marriage, and I told him I wanted to wait a few more years until my career was more settled. He'd seemed okay with it at the time, or at least that's what I thought. But instead of respecting my choice, he decided to take that decision away from me completely by messing with my body chemistry. I felt violated in a way I couldn't even put into words. It wasn't just that he'd poisoned me, it was that he'd tried to force me into pregnancy without my consent. I spent the rest of that day in my room crying and trying to understand how someone I'd loved could do something so awful. Detective Petrov came back a few days later with more news. She said the fertility drug angle meant they could add reproductive coercion to the charges, which carried extra penalties in our state. She explained that the prosecutor, Benjamin Larson, wanted to meet with me to talk about whether I'd be willing to testify if the case went to trial. I told her I would do whatever was necessary to make sure my husband faced consequences for what he did. She scheduled a meeting at the prosecutor's office for the following week. Benjamin Larson's office was in the courthouse downtown, and Tabitha drove me there on a Tuesday morning. He was younger than I expected, maybe in his late 30s, with a friendly but serious manner. He shook my hand and offered me coffee, then sat down behind his desk and pulled out a thick file with my name on it. He explained what a trial would involve if we went that route. I'd have to testify about everything that happened, answer questions from both him and from Quentin Bauer, my husband's defense attorney. He said cross-examination could be tough because Bauer would try to make me seem unreliable or like I was exaggerating. He told me it would be hard emotionally to relive everything in front of a courtroom full of strangers, but he also said my testimony combined with all the physical evidence made this a really strong case, and that he thought we could win if I was willing to go through with it. I told him I needed time to think about it, and he said that was fine, that I should take all the time I needed. A week later, Rosemary called me into her office and said Quentin Bauer had reached out about a possible plea deal. She said my husband was willing to plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for probation and required counseling. I asked what that meant exactly, and she explained it would mean he'd admit guilt, but probably wouldn't go to jail. She called Benjamin Larson while I was sitting there and put him on speaker. He said the plea deal would spare me from having to testify and go through a trial, but it would also mean much lighter punishment for what was basically attempted murder. He said the choice was mine and that he'd support whatever I decided. I sat there staring at the phone and trying to figure out what the right answer was, knowing that either choice would change everything. Over the next few days at the shelter, I couldn't stop thinking about what to do. Tabitha met with me every afternoon in the small counseling room on the second floor, and we talked through everything. She pulled out a notepad and drew 2 columns, one labeled trial and one labeled plea deal. Under trial, she wrote things like public testimony, cross-examination, longer process, possible jail time for him. Under plea deal, she wrote no testimony, faster resolution, guaranteed outcome, lighter sentence. I stared at the paper and felt my stomach twist because both options seemed awful in different ways. Tabitha set down her pen and looked at me directly. She told me there wasn't a wrong choice here, that both paths were valid and that I needed to pick what felt right for me, not what anyone else thought I should do. She explained that some survivors need their day in court to feel heard, while others just want it over quickly so they can move forward. I asked her what she would do, and she smiled sadly and said it didn't matter what she would do, because this was my life and my choice. We spent hours going through scenarios, talking about what trial would feel like versus what accepting a plea would mean. By the 3rd day, I knew what I wanted. I called Benjamin and told him I'd accept a plea deal, but only if my husband got actual jail time, not just probation, and only if the no-contact order was permanent forever. Benjamin said he'd negotiate those terms and get back to me. 2 days later, he called and said Quentin had agreed. My husband would plead guilty to aggravated assault and domestic violence, and in exchange, he'd get 18 months in county jail followed by 5 years of probation. I felt weird hearing those words because 18 months seemed both too long and not long enough at the same time. Benjamin explained the plea hearing would happen fast, probably within a week, and asked if I wanted to read a victim impact statement. I said yes immediately because even though I didn't want a full trial, I still needed him to hear what he did to me. The courthouse was downtown in an old brick building with metal detectors at the entrance. Tabitha drove me there on a Wednesday morning and Rosemary met us in the lobby. We took the elevator to the 3rd floor and waited on a wooden bench outside the courtroom. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, so Tabitha held one and Rosemary held the other. When they called our case, we walked through the heavy doors into a room with rows of benches and a judge's desk at the front. My husband was already there sitting at a table with Quentin, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made him look smaller somehow. His hair was messy and he had dark circles under his eyes. When the judge asked if he understood he was pleading guilty to poisoning his wife, he said yes in this quiet voice I barely recognized. It didn't sound like him at all. The judge asked several more questions about whether anyone forced him to take this plea and whether he understood his rights. He answered yes to everything in that same flat voice. Then the judge looked at me and asked if I wanted to read my statement. I stood up and walked to the podium in front of the judge's desk, holding the papers Tabitha had helped me write. My voice shook as I read about how his actions destroyed my health and my sense of safety. I explained that I'd be dealing with blood clotting risks for the rest of my life, and that I'd never feel completely safe again. I talked about how he took away my choice about having kids by trying to force my body into pregnancy without my consent. I said I'd trusted him completely, and he used that trust to poison me every single day for months. When I finished reading, I looked up and saw him staring at the table. He wouldn't look at me. The judge accepted the plea and sentenced him to 18 months in county jail with credit for the time he'd already served. followed by 5 years of supervised probation with required domestic violence treatment. She issued a permanent restraining order that meant he could never contact me again for any reason. She also ordered him to pay back all my medical bills and counseling costs. The whole hearing took less than an hour. Afterward, Benjamin walked with us into the hallway and told me the sentence was fair given everything. He handed me his business card and said to call him right away if my husband ever violated any terms of his probation. Tabitha hugged me and said I did great reading my statement. Rosemary suggested we get lunch, but I just wanted to go back to the shelter and sleep. 2 weeks later, Rosemary called and said she found me an apartment. It was paid for through an emergency housing grant from Victim Services, a 1-bedroom in a building with security cameras and a locked entry system. She drove me over to see it on a Saturday afternoon. The apartment was on the 2nd floor with a window that looked out at a small park. The kitchen was tiny but clean, and the bedroom had enough space for a bed and a dresser. The landlord showed me how the security system worked and gave me 2 sets of keys. That first night in my own place, I locked both locks and put a chair against the door just to be extra safe. I slept better than I had in months. The divorce moved forward quickly because my husband didn't fight anything from jail. Rosemary filed all the paperwork and negotiated a settlement that gave me the house, my car, and half of our savings account. She explained that his criminal conviction made it impossible for him to argue against a fault-based divorce, which worked in my favor money-wise. The judge signed the final papers 6 weeks after the plea hearing. Rosemary called to tell me it was official, and I felt this huge weight lift off my shoulders. I was legally free. My boss Isabel had been amazing through everything. When I called to tell her I was ready to come back, she said she'd already arranged accommodations for me. I could work from home 3 days a week while I continued medical treatment and counseling. I started back part-time, just mornings at first, and Isabel checked on me every day to make sure I wasn't overdoing it. My coworkers were supportive without being nosy, which I appreciated. It felt good to focus on something normal like work projects instead of constantly thinking about everything that happened. My follow-up appointment with the blood doctor showed my clotting factors were getting better on the blood thinners. He seemed happy with my progress and said he was cautiously hopeful I wouldn't have permanent damage if I stayed on the medication and got my levels checked regularly. He explained I'd need to be on blood thinners for at least a year, maybe longer depending on how my body responded. I'd have to be careful about cuts and bruises since my blood wouldn't clot normally, and I'd need to avoid certain foods that interfered with the medication. He gave me a list of things to watch out for and scheduled my next appointment for 3 months later. Walking out of his office, I felt grateful my body was healing, even though the emotional stuff would take way longer. A few weeks later, a thick envelope arrived from the prosecutor's office with Alonzo Duran's complete toxicology analysis inside. I sat at my small kitchen table and read through page after page of technical details that basically confirmed what I already knew, but seeing it spelled out in scientific terms made it feel more real. The report showed I'd been exposed to clomiphene citrate for approximately 4 months at doses between 50 and 100 milligrams daily, which was way higher than any legitimate medical use. Alonzo's analysis found traces of the drug in my hair samples going back even further, suggesting my husband might have been testing smaller amounts before ramping up to dangerous levels. The report became part of my permanent legal file, and Rosemary used it to strengthen my restitution claim for ongoing medical expenses. Around the same time, I started seeing a trauma therapist that the shelter recommended, a woman in her 50s who specialized in intimate partner violence. Her office was in a quiet building downtown with comfortable chairs and soft lighting that made it easier to talk about hard things. During our first few sessions, I kept apologizing for feeling sad about my marriage ending, even though I knew my husband tried to kill me. She stopped me gently and explained that grief and anger can exist at the same time, that it was completely normal to mourn the relationship I thought I had, while also being furious about the reality of what he did. She helped me understand that I wasn't mourning him exactly, but rather the life I'd built, and the future I'd imagined that turned out to be based on lies. 3 months after the plea hearing, I made the decision to sell the house because every time I thought about going back there, I pictured myself collapsed on that kitchen floor. Rosemary handled all the paperwork and coordinated with a realtor who understood my situation and didn't push me to do showings or open houses. The house sold faster than expected to a young couple who loved the neighborhood, and I signed all the closing documents at Rosemary's office instead of having to go back there one last time. After paying off my medical bills and legal fees, I had enough left over to create an emergency fund that made me feel more financially secure than I had in years. I put the money in a separate savings account that only I could access, and it felt like building a safety net for whatever came next. That same week, Rosemary called to tell me my husband had sent a letter through Quentin Bauer, asking if I'd be willing to participate in some kind of restorative justice meeting as part of his rehabilitation program in jail. I didn't even need to think about it before telling Rosemary no. She drafted a response explaining that I had no interest in facilitating his recovery process, and that the permanent no-contact order existed for good reason, that my healing didn't require me to help him feel better about what he did. Hearing that my answer was simply no, and that I didn't owe him anything, felt powerful in a way I wasn't expecting. A friend from the shelter told me about a support group for survivors of intimate partner violence that met Tuesday evenings at a community center across town. I was nervous the first time I went, sitting in a circle of folding chairs with 7 other women who all had their own stories of abuse and survival. Listening to them talk helped me feel less alone and less weird about my specific situation. One woman named Andrea shared that her ex-boyfriend had been secretly giving her anxiety medication to keep her dependent and compliant. And after the meeting, she came up to me and we exchanged numbers. Having someone who understood the particular violation of medical abuse made a huge difference, because most people couldn't quite grasp how intimate and terrifying it was to have someone poison your body without your knowledge. 6 months after leaving the hospital, I went for a regular checkup with my blood doctor, and he seemed genuinely pleased with my progress. My energy had come back fully, the constant headaches were completely gone, and my blood work showed my clotting factors responding well to the medication. He explained that I was healing better than he initially expected, given how much damage the clomiphene had caused, and that we could start thinking about reducing my medication dosage in another few months. Walking out of his office that day, I felt lighter knowing my body was recovering, even though I knew the emotional healing would take way longer. My therapist and I started working on my trust issues around that time, because I'd mentioned maybe wanting to date again eventually. She helped me identify what healthy boundaries looked like, and how to recognize red flags early instead of ignoring my gut instinct like I did with my husband. I started going out with people I met through friends, keeping things super casual and being upfront about my history and my need to take things slow. The first few dates were awkward because I kept waiting for something to go wrong, but gradually I learned that decent people actually respected my boundaries instead of pushing against them or making me feel bad for having limits. Just before the 6-month mark, Rosemary called with news that the divorce was officially finalized. The judge had signed all the papers and I was legally free from my husband in every way that mattered. I thanked Rosemary for everything she'd done, and after I hung up, I sat on my couch and cried with relief because I hadn't fully realized how much weight I was still carrying until it lifted. A week later, I had another appointment with my medical team, and they reduced my blood thinner dosage for the first time since I started treatment. My doctor explained that my clotting factors continued to improve, and that he was optimistic I might be able to stop anticoagulants completely within another year, though I'd always need regular monitoring to make sure the damage didn't come back. He gave me a new medication schedule and reminded me to be careful about injuries since my blood still wasn't clotting normally, but the fact that I was healing felt like proof that I'd made the right choices. I decided to make my apartment feel like actually mine instead of just a temporary safe space, so I went shopping for furniture and decorations that matched what I wanted, instead of what my husband would have approved of. Isabel came with me to help pick out artwork, and laughed when I insisted on buying 3 different sets of locks for my front door, because feeling secure in my own space mattered more than anything else. We painted the bedroom a soft blue color, and I filled the living room with plants that needed regular care, something I'd never been able to do before because my husband said they made too much mess. The reading nook by the window became my favorite spot, a corner with a comfortable chair and good light where I could sit and read without anyone monitoring what I was doing or asking where I was. My apartment wasn't fancy or big, but it was mine, decorated exactly how I wanted it with bright colors and personal touches that made me smile every time I walked through the door. I started reaching out to old friends the following week, people I'd slowly stopped seeing during my marriage without really noticing it happening. My college roommate Sarah answered my text immediately, and we met for coffee that same afternoon, and she hugged me tight before we even sat down. She told me she'd tried to stay in touch, but my husband always had reasons why I couldn't make plans, and eventually she'd stopped trying because it felt like I didn't want the friendship anymore. I explained what had actually been happening, and she grabbed my hand across the table, her eyes getting watery. We made plans to meet every Thursday for dinner, and she invited me to join her book club that met twice a month. My former coworker from my previous job responded to my message with excitement and invited me to her birthday party that weekend, where I met her whole friend group and exchanged numbers with 3 people who seemed genuinely interested in staying connected. Within a month, I had plans almost every weekend, sometimes multiple things in one day, and my calendar felt full in a way that made me happy instead of stressed. I went to game nights and brunch meetups and movie screenings, and nobody questioned where I'd been or made me feel guilty for having my own life. The difference between controlled isolation and actual friendship became so obvious that I couldn't believe I'd let it happen for so long. Roman called me in early March asking if I'd be willing to speak on a panel about medical abuse in domestic violence situations at a healthcare conference downtown. He explained that they wanted survivor perspectives alongside medical professionals and advocates, and that my experience with fertility drug poisoning was exactly the kind of warning sign they wanted providers to recognize. I agreed immediately because I kept thinking about other women who might be getting poisoned right now without knowing it, women whose doctors might miss the signs like mine almost did. The panel was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and Roman sent me the other speakers' information along with suggested topics to prepare. I spent hours writing notes about the symptoms I'd ignored, the ways my husband had masked his control as concern, and the specific medical red flags that finally exposed what was happening. The day of the panel, I wore a professional dress and sat at a long table with 2 doctors, a toxicologist, and Roman, facing an audience of about 70 healthcare workers. When it was my turn to speak, I told my story clearly and directly, explaining how the clomiphene made me sick, and how my husband used the medical alert necklace to maintain his cover. Several people in the audience were taking notes, And afterwards, 3 different women approached me privately to share their own stories of partners who'd tampered with medications or sabotaged birth control. One nurse told me she'd suspected her patient was poisoned, but hadn't known how to intervene safely, and now she had specific protocols to follow. The anniversary of my kitchen collapse fell on a Tuesday in late March, exactly 1 year since the morning I'd lost feeling in my arm and thought I might die. I took myself to a nice Italian restaurant downtown, the kind of place my husband never would have chosen because he always picked where we ate. I ordered wine and pasta and tiramisu for dessert, and when the server brought my food, I raised my glass quietly to myself. I was healthy with my blood tests, showing continued improvement, safe in my own apartment with 3 sets of locks, financially stable with money saved from the house sale, and surrounded by people who actually cared about me instead of controlling me. I'd built this entire life myself by choosing to tell that doctor the truth when it mattered most, by trusting Tabitha and Detective Petrov and Rosemary when they offered help, and by refusing to let my husband's version of reality become mine. The server asked if I was celebrating something special, and I smiled and said yes, I was celebrating surviving. So yeah, that's the whole story. Nothing fancy, just real life doing its weird thing. Thanks for hanging out with me. It really does feel like catching up with a friend. See you around next time.